Imagine losing everything. Your house, your family, all your money, even your identity. You've just suffered a catastrophe, but you aren't ready to give up. Now what? This isn't a modern predicament. It's the exact situation that our hero finds himself in today. Episode of history. Greatest philosophers. Long ago, in the bustling markets of Athens, a man named Zeno lost everything when his ship sank at sea. Shipwrecked and demoralized, he wandered into a bookshop. He was so depressed that he didn't even have the energy to steal, so he simply sat down in an armchair and waited for someone to notice him. Soon enough, a bookseller approached and asked him what he wanted. Zeno replied that he had no idea, which led the bookseller to ask what kind of books he liked. "I like good ones," said Zeno, which prompted the bookseller to ask what was good. "The ones that make life worth living," replied Zeno. So the bookseller suggested he read some of the books by Socrates, which is when Zeno asked him, "Where can I find a man like that?" "There he is," said the bookseller, pointing toward a nearby philosopher. That small accident of fate was the birth of Stoicism. Like many heroes, Zeno grew up poor. In fact, most accounts say he wasn't even great. But these humble beginnings only fueled his desire to rise above his circumstances and become wealthy. He married and had children and did become successful as a merchant. But then one day at sea, his ship sank, killing his wife and children. Stricken with grief, Zeno set sail for Athens, where fate intervened and brought him to the doorstep of philosophy. But who was this mysterious figure? How did he go from rags to riches to rags again? And how did he start the most influential philosophical school of all time? Let's find out. At the time, the greatest philosopher in Athens was Socrates, a man famous for asking questions instead of giving answers. However, he had recently passed away, which is why Zeno ended up talking to his student, Crates. Unlike Socrates, Crates was poor and lived a simple life. But though he lacked fame and fortune, he was a great role model. When Zeno learned that Crates had given away all of his possessions and was untempted to acquire any more, he knew he had finally found the answer he'd been looking for. He followed Crates around for weeks, trying to understand the secret to his contentment. Finally, the older man noticed and asked what he wanted. Zeno explained his situation and asked for guidance. Socrates agreed to become his mentor, and together they explored the depths of human existence. However, there were two big problems with this arrangement. First, Socrates didn't have a formal school. He met with whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Second, Socrates was already very old. Zeno knew that he wouldn't be around forever, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He gathered the other students of Socrates, and together they created the first school of philosophy. But where would they meet? Since they couldn't afford a building, they gathered in a place that was free and open to all: the streets, parks, and market squares of Athens. However, Zeno wanted something more. He found a small and run-down structure in Athens called the Stoa Poikil, or painted porch. It was a colonnaded gallery decorated with beautiful frescoes. Although its grandeur had faded long ago, Zeno saw its potential. He cleaned up the place and made it into a school. But why? Why did Zeno decide to start a school in the first place? Well, ancient Greece was full of philosophers, but none of them talked about the issues that mattered to Zeno. He'd lost everything. He'd seen people overcome adversity, and he'd witnessed those who had it all lose everything in a flash. He wanted to know, how can we live a good life no matter what happens? To answer this question, he combined the ideas of Socrates with his own experiences and created a new school of thought called Stoicism. But how do you start a school with no money? Well, you gather students who are willing to pay for your services with the currency that everyone has: time. Stoicism was completely free. Zeno did Ewan charge money for his classes, because he knew that people who were down on their luck did Ewan have any extra cash. Instead, he asked for a commitment. His students had to attend every single lecture. No matter what happened, he demanded that they show up to class. Of course, this meant that his students had to be able to afford to give up an hour of their day to learn philosophy. But back then, most people spent their days making things, or trading, so it was quite reasonable. With his school up and running, Zeno began attracting followers, especially among the poor. It seemed like a win-win situation. His students got free education, and Zeno got paid with something that he actually valued: attention. But he still had one major problem. Where would his school get its money? Ancient schools relied heavily on donations from wealthy citizens, but Zeno never begged for money. In fact, he hated begging. He had a deep-seated fear of poverty and shame and would never compromise his dignity to get financial support. So he refused to beg for donations. Instead, he made his students pay for the materials themselves. For example, if he was teaching a class about geometry, each student had to buy their own compass and ruler. But why did his students agree to spend their hard-earned money on these lessons? Because Zeno promised that Stoicism would teach them how to be rich. That's right, he advertised Stoicism as a way to make money. But how does philosophy lead to financial success? Well, Zeno argued that the way you think determines the way you feel. If you want to be confident, you must stop worrying about what other people think. If you want to be happy, you must stop chasing external objects. If you want to be financially successful, you must stop being afraid to take risks. According to Zeno, the universe works like clockwork. Everything that happens is part of a divine plan, and the best way to succeed is to follow that plan. To illustrate his point, he told the story of a farmer who plants a seed. The farmer doesn't know whether the seed will grow into a pumpkin, a watermelon, or any other fruit. But that doesn't stop the farmer from planting the seed. Similarly, we don't know what the future holds, but we shouldn't let that stop us from pursuing our goals. Life is full of ups and downs, and our job is to embrace the whole package, the good and the bad. After all, we can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we react. And that's how Stoicism became the philosophy of choice for emperors and slaves alike. Fast forward a few centuries, and we meet Epictetus, a slave who owned nothing but was considered the greatest Stoic of his time. One day, while cleaning the latrine of his master, Epicurus heard another slave complaining about their fate. "Why am I a slave?" they cried. "I wish I was free." And Epicurus replied, "You're free. Stop acting like a slave." Confused, the other man asked, "What do you mean?" "I'm literally a slave." And Epicurus said, "Yes, but slavery doesn't mean you're powerless. It's your mind that makes you a slave." You see, despite his chains, Epicurus was actually freer than his master. Why? Because he wasn't attached to anything external. He knew that he could be whipped, tortured, or killed. But none of that was important because he didn't possess any of those things. In fact, he didn't possess anything at all. He had no clothes, no food, and certainly no bed to sleep on. But he didn't care. That's because he understood that the only thing that truly belonged to him was his mind. And since he kept his mind free from attachments, he was actually freer than his master. In fact, Epictetus taught that it's our attachment to things that keeps us enslaved. He encouraged his students to become untethered so they could pursue virtue and wisdom without distractions. And this message resonated deeply with everyone, including Roman. One of the most famous Stoics was Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome. As the leader of the empire, he had everything he could ever want, but he also faced immense pressure to maintain order and protect his people. Despite all this, he took the time to write down his thoughts each night. He wrote about death, duty, and the interconnectedness of all living beings. He didn't want to be remembered as a great emperor, but as a good person. You see, even though he was the most powerful man in the world, he knew that he was still just a person. Like everyone else, he experienced fear, doubt, and sadness. But instead of letting these emotions control him, he embraced them and tried to understand their purpose. Through his journal entries, we can see the inner struggles of a man who was trying to live a virtuous life while balancing the demands of his empire. We see a man who was grappling with the same questions that we all grapple with. What is the meaning of life? How should I treat others? And what is my purpose? These questions may have no easy answers. But Marcus Aurelius' reflections offer a timeless guide for anyone seeking wisdom and enlightenment. And that's how Stoicism became the official philosophy of the Roman Empire. But how did it disappear over time? Well, After the fall of Rome, monks started adopting its discipline. Christians started embracing its endurance, and its name started fading away. For hundreds of years, it was as if the painted porch had been abandoned. That is, until modern times when people rediscovered its wisdom and started applying it to everyday life. Today, Stoicism can be found everywhere, from boardrooms to therapy sessions to self-help books. People use it to deal with problems at work, relationships, finances, and life in general. It teaches us how to control our emotions, how to accept what we can't change, and how to focus on what's important. In short, Stoicism gives us a roadmap for living a good life in a chaotic world. So the next time you face a challenge or feel overwhelmed by your problems, remember the story of Stoicism and the painted porch where it all began. And if you want to learn more about ancient philosophy, check out the series in the description. Each episode is like a little adventure filled with action, humor, and tons of information. You will now get to explore ancient Greece and Rome through the eyes of young adventurers who bring history to life.